5 quarterbacks I'm going to bench this week heading into week 12. The first guy's Cam Newton. I know Newton's been playing better the last 3 weeks, but he's still just only getting 25 fantasy points as most, it seems, this year. When this New England team, they prefer to run the ball a lot than pass. Newton, he don't have a lot of help out there at receiver. He only has Myers, N'Keal Harry, and Damiere Byrd, who stepped up in this game. He had a decent game versus Houston, 365 yards and a touchdown, and only 6 rushing yards. But the thing with Newton, the whole season, he don't get many touchdowns. He's only had 1 game this whole year over 30 fantasy points and 2 over 25. So I don't think Newton, you're going to get a huge game out of him here versus Arizona in Week 8, who gives up the 8th most fantasy points, 2 quarterbacks. But Newton, I could just see him having a down, mediocre game where he only gets you anywhere from 17 to 20 points. And I think there's a lot of better options this week to start. So he's the first guy I'm going to bench at quarterback. The second guy is Taysom Hill. It was a great game for Hill and the New Orleans Saints last week, but it was a cupcake matchup for Taysom Hill versus an easy Atlanta Falcon defense that gave up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And now he's got to verse Denver in Denver. It's going to be a little tougher of an atmosphere. He had a couple decent throws in this game, and he hit Michael Thomas and stuff a lot. And they limited him to 51 rushing yards. But if he didn't have those 2 rushing touchdowns, and say they went to Kamara or whoever, he would only had 12 fantasy points. And this game versus Denver, I can only see 15 to 18 fantasy points. It's a different type of game. It's going to be altitude, a better defense than Atlanta Denver is. We just know that immediately. So Hill, I'm not expecting a huge game out of him this week. I know he's got added in a bunch of fantasy leagues the last 2 weeks. It's just still a wait-and-see approach with Hill, unless you're in a 2-quarterback league or something and you got no other options. But Hill, this week, I think his points go down and the numbers go down, so I'm benching him. The third guy is Ryan Tannehill of the Tennessee Titans. I know he had a great game versus Baltimore here in Week 11 with 25 fantasy points, 259 yards, 2 touchdowns in Into, and he even gave you 35 rushing yards and a 2-point conversion. But this week he's got a tough Indianapolis team who he struggled mightily against in Week 10, where he only threw the ball for 147 yards and a touchdown and 9 rushing yards. I know this week this ball game is in Indianapolis, indoors, no weather elements, but I think this is going to be a Derrick Henry type of grinded-out rushing game, and I could see this one being a low-scoring type of ball game as well. Indy blew him out in Week 10, 34-17, but this matchup, I'm going to say, is closer. It's going to be in the low 20s, this ball game, I believe, and I just see Tannehill having a mediocre game once again in this one, so I'm benching him. The fourth guy is Baker Mayfield. I know he's got a great matchup. He hasn't played well, though, Baker, in the last 4 or 5 weeks, but the matchup's great versus Jacksonville, but I don't see him having a great game. He hasn't hit double-digit fantasy points, and this is a quarterback we're talking about since Week 8, and this game versus Jacksonville, I'm only going to say he gets 15 or 16 points in this one. They got good running backs in Chubb and Kareem Hunt. The receivers aren't doing much. I know the weather should be fine finally for them, but Baker, he just don't have it, man, and he just don't have the weapons either. With Beckham out for the season, that hurts the offense obviously as well. So Baker Mayfield, it's going to be another down performance, and he's a guy I'm going to bench if you have him on your roster for whatever reason. And the fifth and final guy is Teddy Bridgewater of the Carolina Panthers. Bridgewater, he was out last week with the knee injury versus the Detroit Lions, but they didn't need him. P.J. Walker looked decent, but this week he's versus the Minnesota Vikings. They've looked a little better over the last few weeks. I know it's in Minnesota. They give up the 10th most fantasy points, but Bridgewater, I could see him have an off game here, and I don't know if he's going to be 100% either, even if he does play. So if Bridgewater plays, there's better options out there. I could only see him getting 17 to 20 fantasy points as well. Those are decent ball games, but we're looking for guys here to have high 25 to 40 fantasy point type games. And Bridgewater with the injury, like I said, I don't know if he's 100%, and he's a guy I'm going to stay away from. So that's 5 quarterbacks I'm benching here heading into Week 12.